As government prepares the budget for the next financial year, it will need to appropriate funds to the most productive sectors of the economy placed in the chokehold by the COVID-19 pandemic. With soaring unemployment, foreclosures on property later sold at the fall of the hammer, and the collapse of small and medium enterprises, government will need to craft a budget that can resuscitate ailing businesses. But as it seeks to plug a budget deficit driven by falling tax collections and provide funds in empty escrow accounts that are used to service rising interest on debt, Daily Monitor newspaper has learned that government plans to table a supplementary budget worth a staggering 700 billion shillings in Parliament early next week. In a letter to the Finance Minister, Matia Kasaija, dated March 11th and copied to the Speaker of Parliament, the Ghana National Oil Company is seeking 481 billion shillings to facilitate the company to sign off investment decisions on projects under oil and gas related to the oil refinery and pipeline that necessitated preparation of Supplementary Schedule 5. The other items on the supplementary budget are a 28 billion State House vote, 101 billion shillings for the Ghana National Roads Authority. The funds, if approved, will plug wage shortfalls for various central and local government, which has a vote of 69 billion shillings, and the Finance Ministry said to receive 2.6 billion shillings. But economists are warning that this could distort the budget processing and could create a culture of retrospective accountability where funds are spent and government reverts to Parliament to rubber stamp the approval.
How do we merge this, and how do we ensure that we are disciplined and stick to the budget? It's hard to. There are times when it's inevitable. For instance, during the pandemic, it was inevitable that government reallocates resources and things like that, and that can be understood. But then you see a lot of fiscal indiscipline and requesting for supplementary budgets for things that should have been foreseen during the budgeting process. The other thing is sometimes asking for supplementary budgets is an indictment on the process of the process itself through which the budget is developed. It could be that the process is not consultative enough, and therefore it is not able to sufficiently foresee what government will need to spend on.
Has also been the consistency in the budget that, you know, when you have the supplementary budgets, then planning becomes a bit more difficult, because then sometimes in the middle of the year it can take away money from productive sectors to non-productive ones. And that is not a question that, you know, economists have a solution on. It's a behavioral issue.
It's also very important that we are fiscally disciplined, and that's why the Public Finance Management Act sought to cure, but seems not to have cured properly. Okay? How do we ensure that you are disciplined? A budget is as good as your ability to stick to it. If you're not able to stick to it, then it's not an indicator of what you intend to do at all.
This comes at a time when there's a spike in government's borrowing from commercial banks. In March 2021, the Auditor General, John Mwanga, warned government should stay back from heavily borrowing from commercial banks, saying it presents a risk to growth and access to private sector credit. In a report for the period ended June 2020, the Auditor General indicates that government's non-concessional loans borrowed from commercial banks had spiked over the past 3 years, growing from just 192.6 billion shillings in the 2017-18 financial year to 2.8 trillion shillings for the period ended June 2020.
When we borrow domestically, we are crowding out the private sector. It means businesses, small businesses, find it harder to get loans. Banks find government to be a more reliable borrower, so they won't lend to businesses. They'll find all kinds of excuses. You're risky, you're this, you're informal, and things of the sort. So ultimately, government is sabotaging its long-term goal of generating sufficient domestic revenue.
Fitch's credit rating for Uganda was last reported at B+, with a negative outlook. In general, a credit rating is used by sovereign wealth funds, pension funds and other investors to gauge the creditworthiness of a country, thus having a big impact on the country's borrowing costs. It's what analysts fear is driving the government to borrow less from Bretton Woods institutions like the World Bank by resorting to local commercial banks.
Yeah, after COVID-19, the growth has slowed by over 50%, from an average of about 6% to 3%. And when you look at the budget and you look at the key elements of it, you can clearly see where the risks are. For example, over 33% going into debt repayment and servicing debt, which is at 15.2 billion right now, US dollars. And when you look at the domestic revenue of about 25 trillion, it leaves you wondering whether we have not approached now a fiscal cliff.
Largely, two schools of thoughts are emerging on how countries with COVID-19 economic slump. One of them involves offering stimuli to propel aggregate demand. For all developed countries like Uganda, which have a constrained fiscal space, they have struggled to offer a comprehensive stimulus package to drive aggregate demand. A Keynesian rule of thumb largely adopted in Western countries like America, which is directly placing funds in the hands of families.
Different ways. In the US, you had the crash of 1928. Okay. Then you had what I would call very free market and liberal policy that says government's role is to regulate, the private sector should get and do work. The challenge is that how do you rein in capitalistic kind of tendencies? So this is the school of thought that tends to go for, during a crisis, that tends to go for austerity, cutting back and so on. There's another school of thought that focuses on government spending during times of crisis. In fact, this school of thought now is very more widely accepted. That's why you see during this crisis, governments are spending and are spending and are spending and are spending.
Government continues to create new districts and cities and a growing bureaucracy which has led to soaring public administration costs, largely anchored on the clientele patronage politics. The policy of creating new administrative units has faced flack from policy wonks keen on running a lean government.
If your expenditure is going into structures or district, bureaucracies and say, parliamentary numbers increase and you have to spend more, then it takes away the fiscal room or freedom for you to make the investments you would have made in developing the processing sector, which is absolutely necessary to backstop the investments that you're making in the rural economy through the EMUGA program, through the parish model. So that is the gap that I see.
Spending, but we are spending on the wrong thing. So the approach of spending is actually correct, but I think it needs to be spending coupled with austerity. Austerity for non-essential expenditure. In the sectors that matter, you need to be very generous in terms of public expenditure. So I think we are having a mismatch here. We are spending, but most of the money is going into, security is very, very important, but in a time of crisis, you can kind of cut this down. Public administration and making sure people are employed in a public service is very critical, but time of crisis, this can also be cut down.
Mayanja reveals that government can create a fiscal room for reining in on government expenditure and limiting borrowing.
So I would have felt that instead of borrowing, and we've almost hit the ceiling of 50% debt to GDP ratio, the debt to tax revenue ratio is also hitting the ceiling. And so then it would be that to create fiscal room, the economic management or better macroeconomic management that is promised in the budget framework paper might increase a rationalization of government expenditure to reduce government expenditure. And that would be the way you create some fiscal room.
As a method of recovering from the slump, government has committed to clear outstanding domestic areas of nearly 600 billion shillings owed to local investors to revive the manufacturing sector and hence improve tax collection.
You see, I've seen places where the tax, tiers or corporate tax changes according to the gross revenues. That, if you go to say 100,000 USD revenue, then you qualify for a lower tax rate to allow you to expand. And that kind of policy can make us create medium-sized enterprises out of small enterprises.
Uganda has one of the lowest tax to GDP ratios in the region. In March, the International Monetary Fund highlighted the example of Georgia, which was able to enforce sweeping reforms to improve its tax to GDP ratio. Amongst the progressive reforms, the country adopted a revised tax code, which simplified the tax system. Rates were reduced and local taxes that were generating little revenue were phased out. Progressive personal income tax rates were replaced with a flat rate of 20%, and the Social Security contribution tax rate was first reduced by 33% and then eliminated altogether. Corporate income was taxed at a flat rate of 15%, and the value-added tax was reduced from 20% to 18%. The revenue lost from low tax rates was made up through a broader tax base, better compliance and strict enforcement. The Uganda Revenue Authority has of recent adopted stringent enforcement methods and tried to halt leakages by introducing the electronic fiscal receipting and invoicing solutions. Mayanja says government should desist from enforcing taxes that are retrogressive and create an imbalance.
That if you invest a lot in production per se, without a necessary fiscal, tax policy that will grow the processors, i.e. allowing them to bring machinery tax-free, and then giving those that have reached a certain turnover, a reward in terms of a reduction in corporate tax, which then creates them to become stronger. It means that you create the balance whereby if your productivity aim works out and you have more output, it can be absorbed in the processing sector. And when it's absorbed in the processing sector, then you create a longer shelf life, which creates better economic value.
You want to bring more people into the tax bucket, you need to create incentives for them. People cannot willingly pay tax if there are no benefits. You can use the carrot, the incentives, or you can use the stick, which is enforcement. I'll go for the carrot and a bit of the stick. But ultimately, we must ensure that our tax rates are low enough that they disincentivize anyone who wants to dodge tax. Okay? At the moment, our tax rates are rising every other year, and that's a problem. You can't broaden the tax base that way. You have to lower it, and you have to attract more people into the base. And I think it's in this regard that URA and government needs to do more. Because raising a tax does not mean that you get more. There's a threshold beyond which it won't make a difference.
He adds government should offer tax incentives to SMEs to spur growth that will automatically transform the rural backwaters that supply agro products to urban dwellers.
So there would have been more consistency and balance that as you invest in the rural areas, you also look at where they are going to sell, and then you have a consistent flow. And then you also look at the globalization trend, whereby sustainability in a value chain depends on it being linked to a global market, which is much larger than the limited, local market. So, for example, if you expand fisheries interventions, then you're going to have a fiscal policy that enables processors that will process the omega-3s and the omega fatty acids that can then be exported.
The COVID-19 pandemic has amplified the digital economy, but restrictive taxes and data seem to have knocked a sting out of relying on this versatile space. Mayanja profiles that cyberspace offers a value chain linked to the global market, which is placed at the doorstep.
COVID has created a situation of social distancing and then ushered in the digital economy, where the youth in the urban areas and SMEs are relying on these global platforms, digital platforms, to integrate in the global economy, which would then have a knock-on effect on your exports, your service exports. But when you have a fiscal stance where you put tax on data and on these digital platforms, then it creates a situation whereby you've chosen which part of the sector you're going to intervene, and yet the data is giving us something different. So when you look at the top 10 companies on the NYSE a few years ago, they used to be brick and mortar companies. They are now digital companies. So you would have expected that in this new NDP3, they would have...
There may be no specific economic antidotes to uplift Uganda's wobbly economy, but a number of measures enforced by an austere bureaucracy that favors fiscal discipline in the place of wasteful expenditure could be the saving grace.